G'day, welcome back to the next video in my series on chess stats. This is where I look at some of the numbers behind chess rather than the game of chess itself. I've done a couple on endgames and now I'm changing my focus to the opening of the game. One thing which is always very interesting when World Chess Championship matches come along is how much preparation have the players done. How far will they be playing and following other people's games before they, whip out a novelty? And I've always wanted to investigate this a bit. So what I've done is I've got all the World Chess Championship matches. I mean, I've got that database. I've been going through the blunders, so it's a little bit over 1,000 games, and use that to work out how many games of theory players play before the game becomes unique. So what I'm going to do in today's video is I'm going to go through that analysis and show you how I did it and the process using a couple of my favorite tools, Python Chess and Scout Fish. And then we'll sort of flick through some of the chart of the results and have a look at a couple of maybe the more interesting sort of games or matches and try and draw some trends. Let's first of all go to my capture screen. That's a position we can look at later. And what I want to do is just quickly have a look at a bit of the code so that maybe you can try and do some of this yourself. So first of all, it opens up PGN, which will have all the games in it. I provide a PGN and Python Chess to filter through the games. It's right here. This is the query we're passing into it. So basically, after a certain number of moves, we create the fan of that position. And if we find that fan of that position in a bigger database, then we know the position's been played before and move on. So that's kind of the logic, just using the fan of the position. This just kind of helps with, transpositions. The position might be the same, but came through different move order and so on. So this is kind of testing if the positions have occurred before. It's just sort of go through the process of what we've been doing. So first of all, over here, we have our database of all the World Chess Championship games. And then we'll just pick one game. And then you've got the moves. Just a little trial of this is the move of the game. So let's say this is the 10th move. We get to the 10th move, get the position on the board. Very well drawn. And then what we do is we've got a bigger database over here, CASA. We've been using a CASA database, got a couple of million games in it. And we see if the position is in the CASA database. Now, if it is not in the CASA database, then that means that's a new position. And if it's new position, what I then go is I'll go back up the moves. That was move 10, go back up until you find the first. I mean, a game will, unless a game ends before a novelty, game will have a novelty in it. Now, if the position is in the database, then what I do is I jump down a bit. I'm using 8 moves, jump down a bit. And we test again to see if that position is in the database. And if it is not, we keep on going down. And if the position is in the database, then we step back. I go back one game at a time. I mean, there'd probably be some binary search here, which could work quicker until I find the position which is the first new position on the board. And if I get back one move from that, I can actually find out what stem games the game is moving on from. So that's two pieces of information I can get out of it. How many moves of theory were played, what theory was prevalent or known at the time, and then what the novelty is. Let me load up the spreadsheet where I did that analysis. Just click over here, use Libra. Okay, here we go. Here's the spreadsheet. Now, you can see what I've done here is it's all the World Chess Championship matches, 1886, starting at Zukertort, all the way up to 2024, Bukesh Ding. And basically, you can see I've provided 2 lines. Now, the top line, the blue line, is the median number of moves, right? And you can see that it sort of started off about, this is ply, by the way, so about 10 to 12, so that's about 6 moves, and then it went to 20 ply, 10 moves, 25 ply, 12 and a half, 13 moves, right? And within that, there's obviously a bit of variation. There are some games which go much further, which we'll look at, and some games less. And then I put a minimum line in as well, just to sort of say what was the sort of the first deviation or novelty in the different matches, right? And I think we can come to a few conclusions here. Not much prep, but increasing. And then we had a first peak, Lasker, Capablanca, and Alekhine really we hit this first peak of, quite a bit of research and analysis. And we're talking, a lot of Queen's Gambit declines and so on, right? And then we have a little period after that where it sort of declines a bit. That's the Bogolyubov, which is kind of, not regarded as the highest quality World Chess Championship. And then we then hit a new phase. This is 1948, which is after World War II, where once again we've got an increasing sense of mainly the median in terms of the sort of preparation. So now we're talking up to basically 15 to 20, like 10 moves of prep. And of course, it takes two to tango here. Obviously, both players are prepping and all that sort of stuff. And then we break into a new phase, actually with 1969, which is almost like, it's almost you kind of, 66 was also Spassky-Petrosian, but 66, then 69. And now we've hit a new level, which kind of you hold for a little while, all through the Karpov-Kasparov years, right? Of, you're at least playing 7 or 8 moves of prep as a minimum, and most of the games are like 12 moves of prep from both sides, right? And then I think if we would keep drawing spurious conclusions here, if we go to the post-Kasparov, we're talking Anand, Kramnik, those players, Topalov. This is a really intense period where both the minimum amount of moves and the median is now like 13, 14, 15 moves of opening prep. I mean, there's no surprise here. Obviously, the overall trend is up, up, and up, but you can see sort of a couple of sort of plateaus and different periods. And then the most interesting thing, I think, is you'd say it's sort of the advent of the Carlsen period, where it actually, the minimum doesn't have much of a trend, but the number of moves of prep actually is reduced a bit. No one would accuse any of these players of not doing their opening prep. Carlsen's obviously thought of being a bit more casual in that regard, but obviously they're still doing 12 moves of prep. Maybe they're finding novelties with computers in lines which are, a little bit less well developed. I mean, look, Queen's Gambit declines and Grunfeld's whatever go on forever, right? But Carlsen used the Sveshnikov and a bit of work on the Petrov by different players, so you can see it dropped a little bit. So it's quite interesting, that trend that we've seen basically since 2010. Okay, so that gives you a very sort of broad overview of why what I wanted to look at. How many moves of opening prep are there, and how's it sort of evolved and developed through time. And I was going to add a bit of color to that. By now, we're going to look at a few games which sort of give you a bit of perspective of how the opening prep, what type of openings it has been in, and how much deeper it's gone, and the impact it's had in some matches. Because actually, in some matches, sort of like opening prep has decided, not the match, but a particular game. I've picked a number of games I want to look at. This Kramnik Liko one is the last game we are going to look at, but we're going to start game one. We're going to start it. So this is obviously, that's the database of all the World Championship games. So we're going to go to the very first game. Now I might just move the PGN across. In fact, PGN something, I'll try and share that. And you can see this is what my code spits out. It spits out a PGN where it has included the sort of stem games and where the novelty happens. Now, this is very early. I don't really consider this valid, but it just gives you an idea. It's D4, D5, C4, C6, a Slav back in the day. And there's all the variations, all the other moves which have been played up to this point in time. Apparently, somebody played F5, somebody played E6, and somebody played Knight F6. Now, I'm not for 1 minute thinking Bishop F5 is really a novelty. Earlier on in my database, there aren't too many games before this game, which was in 1986. So somebody must have played Bishop F5. It's just not in the database. And you can see the other games there. Deacon Lowe, Kennedy Mucklow, Davidson Ware, all played 1876, 1851, all those sorts of things, right? So that gives you a sense of, okay, there's the first novelty, in inverted commas, in a World Chess Championship match. So let's move on. Also a game from the first match, game 23. Game 20, sorry. And I picked this because it had 23 moves of theory. We'll go through the game. E4, E5. What do we got? Sometimes the buttons don't work. We'll do better. Okay, we've got a Vienna. Okay, Vienna's pretty popular back in the day and very popular in... Okay, so here's the novelty in this position. Now, it's interesting. You look at the previous game. It actually was a Steinitz-Martinez one. They're playing games. Presumably, Zucator was familiar with this. And the previous game, King F8, which according to the engine is actually the best move, but you want to play that, which is Steinitz Martinez, 1884, and what he played was knight f5, which turns out very, very bad, and we don't need to go through too much, but I think part of the problem which Duke Tort is facing is that his queen is in a bit of trouble, and there we go, lost the queen, and then he resigned, right? So this was the first World Chess Champion match, and yeah, we had 23 plies or 12 moves of theory in one of the games. So this is just going to be a bit of a tour. I'm going to go to game 185, but now we're hitting Lasker versus Capablanca, and they had a lot of games with quite deep theory on the Queen's Gambit, which wouldn't be so out of place nowadays. Let's have a look at how this one proceeded. Okay, Queen's Gambit declined. Orthodox variation. That's something like a Tartakower, but it's missing the h6 move, so I don't know if that makes it a valid sort of version of that. a6, exchange white squared bishops, exchange black squared bishops, and you can see here that this is the 1921 World Championship, and this exact position Capablanca had this as black against Marshall in 1915, and now he has it as white against Lasker in 1921. 13 moves of theory in this World Chess Championship. This was the game with the least moves of theory across everything, right? And you can have a look. What a strange opening. You'd say it's a Grunfeld, so he's playing f3. Now this I'm sure this translates back because this is just going to be some sameish possibly against the Grunfeld or the King's Indian, depending on what they thought they were playing back then. And because f3 is such a weird move, everything else has been played apart from f3 at this stage, and f3 possibly had been played at this move or a later move. But in terms of the way I was analysing it, this pops up as the earliest novelty in inverted commas. I included this game because this was Tal-Botvinnik actually had a lot of opening theory in it. So this is game 7, famous win by Tal, and let's have a look how many moves. It's first of all, I should point out they're playing the Caro-Kann. So obviously, one thing you do with this, you see which openings the novelties are in, which tends to explain which openings the players were playing the most. So fairly standard Caro-Kann. Pressure. Takes bishop. Bishop takes. Queens are off, even though Tal wins. You can see theory was Tal Ilivitsky, 1955. That's 5 years earlier in this game, where he played King F1 as a discovered check, and presumably his improvement for this game was b4, which is actually, you can see that, move 16. Very, very deep analysis. Had Tal prepared this for this match, most likely, because he knew he'd be playing Caro-Kann's against Botvinnik. I think I included this one because this is perhaps the deepest, one of the deepest ones. You can see the game there. It's also a Caro-Kann, and we get all the way. I'll just skip to it. There's some transposition here, so it doesn't show the game. So after h5, apparently this is Ivkov Palmer from 1964, which is 2 years earlier than this game. And look at where we are. I mean, it's almost an end game. How far this game is, it's just following a previous game. So getting at this stage, as I said, there seemed to be a bit of a crossover between sort of the Botvinnik era and moving on to the Petrosian. Maybe it's a crossover point. Spassky, Fischer, Karpov, Kasparov. It's sort of a shift to much sort of deeper analysis across the board. There was no games with not much theory in them. Okay, so now we're in Kasparov's era, 1985, and I thought it'd be interesting to show one of the things everybody remembers is his sacrifice in the Scheveningen in Sicilian. Now, we've kind of passed over. I mean, as you go through this, Karpov Korchnoi, you saw a lot of like open Spanish and so on. But anyway, by the time we got to Kasparov Karpov, in this position, you'd think d5 not possible, and black's already played d6, so it's wasting a tempo. But this was Kasparov's gambit in inverted commas, and I'd like to point out that it is gambit, but on the other hand, it also is not new. No surprise, but obviously Kasparov, he popularized it at the top level, although it didn't stay popular very long because it was almost like a sort of a special hit for the World Chess Championship. And you see in this position, the stem game was Honfi Delhi, 1965. That's like 20 years earlier actually, and people obviously concluded that it wasn't a great line. What Karpov played, bishop c4, and that led to a draw. But of course, as we know, this was trotted out a second time. B4, bishop e2. Karpov's obviously had a couple of days to sort of prepare and be ready for it. But this game is famous. We're not going to go through it, but it's, let me pick a position. There we go. It's the octopus knight game. So this was a case of somebody had come up with a novelty and, you know, one game drawn, one game lost. That will just really, we'll continue going through a few of these games. Kasparov started playing the Scotch in his later matches against Karpov, and then when Short was all, you know, armed with gills with the Marshall, he never got a chance. Kasparov always went for the anti-Marshall. And then we get to Vichy's games and 849, and this is where there was another novelty. I think 2 games, Kasparov whipped out the dragon. And this, there's a lot of theory to the dragon. Let's just go through. I'm going to switch through knight f4, so we get, this is the position, yeah. And this is the famous one, I think, where Vichy blundered at the end of the game. But 18 moves, you know, 35, 36 plies deep, and that's transposed into a game. Says anyway, there's a lot of theory in the dragon, and therefore, you know, Kasparov and both Anand. I mean, we're talking, you know, people who are very well known for their use of computers and computer analysis, and using that to come up with their novelties. And this period we're entering now is actually where there's really, really deep analysis. If I go to game 860, okay, this is the famous 2000 World Championship match where Kramnik used the Berlin, completely nullified Roy Lopez, and he had to go and do something else. But this is game 1, played straight away for Berlin. Now we'll just quickly go, this is like very standard sort of Berlin-y play, the Berlin endgame. We go forwards, and what you can see is that everybody knew the Berlin. Everybody thought the Berlin was slightly bad for black. Nobody wanted to play it. And, you know, Kramnik had the sort of bravery and sense to realize that actually it's a really good opening, gives both sides chances, and he got a bunch of draws. But it was still, you know, it was 25, 26 moves of prep, which presumably both he and Gary knew, and then he actually understood the end game a bit better by us studying a lot more, and Kasparov could not break him down. So that's an event, that's an example of a novelty which everybody's kind of familiar with. Going to move down to a different type of opening. This is Petrov, right? We haven't seen the Petrov lately, but I think this Kramnik-Liko game, a very high standard of opening play and opening prep, and obviously it was drawn in the end. So very, very tight match. 34, 35 moves of prep, and the game's a draw. So both people knew exactly what they were doing. And, you know, Petrov has been used by quite a few people recently in the World Chess Championship games. And the last one I'm going to show you for today, which is the famous mistake by Kramnik. Finally got a Marshall. Let go specialist in the Marshall, along with people like Aronian and so on. So it's all prep, all prep, all prep, all prep. One of the lines, rook e4, g5, drive the queen away. Look, here we go. So this is all the choices, and apparently knight d2. Knight d2 is not possibly. I don't really believe it's a new move, but it's a move. And you can see all the other moves which have been played. f3, and you can see there is a bishop d1. There's another line. f3 again. Queen e2 is another line. And Hebden. Many choices here. Knight d2 played, which is unusual because it blocks the bishop's diagonal. Bishop f5. Attack the rook. f3 now. Knight f6, rook e1, rook e8, change a pair of rooks. a4 could break down the queen side, queen g6, d3. Now this is where there was the story about Leko had gone one move deeper in the analysis. Queen d1 should be played, queen e2 was played, rook e2, and then for whatever reason, Kramnik on his computer thought this position was winning. No, I'm running a stockfish in the background here. It just shows -4 to black already, right? So this was an example where opening prep actually determined the result of a game. I'm not going to go through it all. Queen d3 was the move which apparently the Kramnik's team had not looked at very closely, and there's not a lot to be done. Just the next couple of moves, you can see obviously that piece gets back. But what do we got here in terms of balance? It's a piece and a rook for the queen, but a very exposed king, and this final sacrifice here picks up the rook. Now it's a bishop pair, but it's black wins from there. So this was an example of where the player who had prepped one move deeper was able to get a winning advantage from. Did the analysis, showed the chart, how much opening prep the World Chess Champions have had to do, and this actually points you at another thing: what openings are in sort of flavor at different points in time. And I'm going to look at it a bit more deeply in future videos. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.